What we're going to do now, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the purpose. We launched into our international guests so they didn't have to stay up till 11 o'clock. But what we're doing today is a bit of showcasing of some examples of informal volunteering, but we're also going to have some small group work so that people can start teasing out some of these issues as well. So it won't be all just sitting and listening. We're also going to have a break at about 10:15, so in about half an hour. So if you hang in there, we'll break for morning tea out there. So in this next session, well, firstly, I'll just give you a tiny bit of background to this, how this symposium came about. I'm a academic over at the Crawford School of Public Policy, so I come to this as a political scientist to actually look at democracy participation. So I've been looking at a lot of community-led problem-solving, grassroots work from kind of more of the political democratic angle, which came out in some of that presentation. And Elise is also working on this more from care and sort of concepts of work. We've been working with Heba, who is right behind me, and she's going to present some of her work that she's been doing with Volunteering Australia in a minute, but also she's doing her PhD here at ANU, not specifically on volunteering, but she's done amazing research for our project. And Sue Regan, who's I'm sure many of you know from Volunteering Australia, has been supporting us in this research as well. So that's just a background to why we wanted to hold this symposium, mainly to form networks amongst ourselves and to present some preliminary work that we've been doing and to start a conversation on what many of you probably realise is quite a dynamic and growing interest. So in this next half an hour, we've got two really interesting presentations. The first is from Peter Davis, who's there on the left. Peter's from Blood Bikes Australia, and he's going to tell us more about that in a minute. But you can see from his bio that he's had a really interesting background, was a cartographer for 40 years, and then a bus driver for another 5 years. But he's more recently has formed and is the founder of Blood Bikes Australia, which now has 279 fully qualified volunteers, and he's going to share some insights into the informal volunteering that goes on in his group. And then we'll move on to Heba Adawy, and she's going to actually talk to us about a project she did with faith-based and cultural communities. So I'll hand it over to Peter. We've got sort of about 8 to 10 minutes. Yep, and then we'll open it up for questions after that.
Do I just click?
You should be able to.
Good day, everyone. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, good. I'm Peter Davis. I started a group of volunteer motorcyclists that offer a last resort transport service to the medical industry throughout Australia. And after that presentation, I get why I'm here. Because one of the things that we've done in Blood Bike Australia in an evolutionary way is created a formality around informality, created a space between informal and formal. So that's really what why I'm presenting here, and I get why they put me in this room, man. But firstly, I think it's best to sort of give you some background and give you some details, and then we can move on from there. I started Blood Bike Australia before the pandemic in September 2019 because a mate of mine was volunteering for Blood Bikes in Scotland. And I thought, what a bloody good idea. A chance to ride my bike, an excuse to ride my bike, and do some good at the same time. So I did a bit of research into the way it worked in the UK and the requirements here in Australia. Found very quickly that the model in the UK wouldn't work in Australia, not because there's anything wrong with the model in the UK, it's just that the model in the UK, they're very much front line. They're part of the NHS, as you see there, and they're very much the main resource for moving medical stuff, that's a technical term, that stuff, from where it is to where it needs to be. We didn't need that. We had a very, very efficient medical courier system in Australia. So I saw straight away there was not the need for that. Where the need was when everything went pear-shaped, and and a courier wasn't available, and this blood had to get to this operation, or this bit of equipment had to get from A to B. So that's where I came at the model to start with. I emphasise that it was me. People say to me, they say, well, did you ever think blood bites would get to where it is now? And I said, look, I had no expectations. I started Blood Bites Australia, so I had an excuse to go for a ride. No one can argue with you if you're going for a ride and doing some good at the same time. Tick, no worries, you know. So anyway, so then, but I sensed that there was potential there. So right from the word go, I sort of to structure it in a way that suited me. Don't like committees. I was paying for all my expenses, so didn't want a bank account, didn't want charity, anything like that. So I sort of stumbled into the structure. Fortunately, a mate of mine, he owned a blog, website, Facebook, you know, normal stuff called Motorbike Rider. He was my riding buddy. We often went riding, often twice a week. And he promoted the idea of Blood Bites Australia on his thing, and then all of a sudden I've got 10, 15, 100, and now we have on our books 466 volunteers. So and so, you know, everybody, and I thought, oh well, this is new in Australia. How cool is this? No pandemic, you know. Anyway, I'm working through the structure, and we'll go through the structure later on. But as we went through it, one of our volunteers in Sydney, his daughter was doing, the pandemic came, so one of his daughters was doing a research project comparing the 1919 Spanish flu to the COVID-19, and she came across this photo. So what I thought started in the UK about 30 years ago, and what I thought I had started in Australia, actually was started in Australia 104 years ago, and they were started in Balmain, and it was a group of motorcyclists called SOS Motorcyclists. They would transport, doing exactly what we're doing, only they also all had sidecars, so they used to transport doctors and nurses to where they were required. So everything that's old is new again, eh? So I'm not so unique after all, though my wife says I am. So we had the opportunity, because the building's still there, so we took the opportunity to get the Sydney volunteers, and I rode, me and a couple of other Queensland guys rode down and reenacted in front of the same building, which was seriously cool. Okay, so a bit of stuff. I said started last resort, very important last resort. We are dogmatic about that, and it also allows us to do work for commercial organisations, because we're not really working for them. We're working for better outcomes for the patient, so that we're very. And I was just saying before, we've had cases now where we work for commercial organisations because they were testing the viability of a particular courier run. And then we've proved it viable, and now they've employed a courier to do it. So we don't have to do it. Check, job done. We're active in every state and territory in Australia. Just recently, I was in Longreach for the Australia Day there as an ambassador for Australia Day. I'm not really sure why, but I was. And I've now got 3 volunteers in Longreach, which is pretty cool. We've got 54 healthcare providers we operate for throughout Australia, and looking for more. If anyone here is in the healthcare industry and wants a last resort opportunity to get something from where it is to where it needs to be, we can do that. And so we're fully licensed motorboat riders. We've got to have 3 years experience, completely self-funded. So we don't have a bank account. We don't have a committee. We are basically, it took me ages to figure out how to define what we are. And ultimately, it was really cool because I found a really good definition. We're the world's first volunteer franchise because, and so ultimately what happens is you'll see the agreement that every rider does and the qualifications that every rider does. They agree to that, and then from then on, they're autonomous. And they're autonomous because they look after all their own. I don't need a bank account because they look after all their expenses as well. So it's, there's no tax deductibility or anything like that because we're not a charity or anything like that. So, so we're not we're not an emergency services. We're not on the right slide.
I keep going, one
more. We don't want to replace existing transport. We're not looking to take anyone's jobs. We're not asking anything in return for our service. We're not looking to profit from any way. Right, so where does the formality of this informality come? This is the basis under which every volunteer agrees. This is I did this because one of the healthcare providers needed it. So I call it a memorandum of understanding because that's what they wanted. So I wrote it and said, this is a memorandum of understanding. Basically, it outlines the tasks, our tasks, their tasks. We commit to, basically our task is we commit to be available when we're showing available. We commit to picking up when they ask us to and dropping it where it is safely. And we commit to keeping it secure and weatherproof. Their commitment is that they supply us all the relevant information for pick up and drop off. And then they supply whatever we're transporting in the way that's commensurate with their regulations. So, so that sort of explains that. Then we have the. Oops.
Got about 2 minutes, Peter.
There we go. This is our rider agreement. Now, there was lots of things brought up before, and lots of this answers a lot of questions. Insurance was brought up. Well, one of the requirements of a rider, a volunteer for Blood Bikes Australia, is they are required to have full motorcycle insurances that covers them for the volunteer work they're doing. And we have 13 or 14 of the major insurers throughout Australia that will cover our volunteers under their normal private policy. Tick. They need to be qualified. So you'll notice up there is a blood transport certificate that is nationally recognised, done by eLearning Australia. Every qualified volunteer is required to have completed that and to show evidence that they have done that. We set a code of conduct. You've got to be nice. When you got the yellow vest on, don't give anyone the finger. Try to ride courteously and all that sort of stuff. Be courteous to everyone that's your touch point. When you've got our vest on, when you're in uniform, that's a requirement. And also, we're not an emergency service, so we must stick to all the road rules. We require 3 years riding experience, not licence riding, because heaps of people that ride bikes have been riding them since they were this high, but they do require an open licence. So we don't want P plates on volunteers, not because we've got anything against P plates, just not a good look. And it sort of makes people happier. And then, of course, this uniform, we've specified the uniform, we get it made in one place. It's a vest. Everyone buys their own uniform, but we get it done in one place, so there's total uniformity in the uniform. That's probably why they call it uniform.
Hey, Peter, we've got about 2 minutes because we've got to wrap up for Heba. please.
Okay. What do you want me to do?
Or just wrap up, if you could.
Okay. Rightio.
Apologies.
Okay. Rightio. So how do we do all this? We've got an app where the volunteer is able to show when they're available and when they're not available. And the healthcare provider simply has their own link, and then they can see where a blood bike is available. They click on that person and contact that person directly. There's no infrastructure. So what we do: whole blood, blood products, test samples, donor tissue, clinical trial programs, in-home treatment medicines, return patients, personal items, biopsies, basically anything that they need, anything the medical industry needs as a last resort to get from where it is to where it needs to be. We've done 4,300 deliveries, travelled about 500 million kilometres. We've got 465 volunteers on our books. 300 of them are qualified active volunteers. So that's it. That's what we do. That's how it works. We do have a table at the display area. Number 11 is our table. You'll probably notice this. And if you want to ask any more questions, please do.
Thanks so much, Peter. I'm going to hand over now to Heba for her to share some insights from a project she's done on culturally diverse communities.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much, Caroline and Peter. So between September 2021 and March 2022, I conducted a series of ethnographic interviews for Volunteering Australia, and it was a story project for Volunteering Australia in collaboration with the Scanlon Foundation. And I think, yeah, hang on. Am I on the right side? Yes. So basically, the objective of this research was to showcase Australia as a multicultural community through diverse stories of volunteering. And I took an interpretive approach to this research. So I was foregrounding bottom-up conceptualizations, and I tried to refrain wherever possible from using the word informal volunteering in my interviews. And I tried to work with the language of my interlocutors. So broadly, the aim was to capture a range of non-dominant community activities that fit the description of time freely given for the common good. And my focus was also on Australians with multicultural upbringing, and I focused on a few sites of analysis, which were religious organization, cultural associations, and also interest-based sites such as community gardens. So I'm primarily drawing upon insights from culture and faith-based volunteering. And there were some early insights that emerged very quickly into my project, that volunteering within cultural and faith-based networks was a nodal point through which community was established and a sense of belonging was established. Even where evidence of vertical ties with the government through a level of trust in their policies was imprecise, volunteering contributed to a sense of belonging by enabling horizontal connections between community members, within and between different community members. And it allowed emerging and established communities to forge their own sense of belonging to Australia, where Australianness was commensurate with the uniqueness of one's identity and difference, rather than a homogeneous assimilation into an Anglo-Celtic mainstream. And the second major insight was that volunteering within these communities was much more consistently practiced, but it could be culturally nuanced and specific, and therefore they were often invisibilized because there were different terms associated with it. So for instance, one of my interlocutors, Manju, who opened up a community garden in Canberra, described her activities as an act of shared love, and she took inspiration from her church gatherings where she would cook meals for her community every month. Srini, who opened a Telugu language school, which is a South Indian regional language, described his work and the work of other volunteer teachers as Swami Chand Seva, which meant pure service or pure willingness. And he also described this as an act of working without any expectation of personal benefit whatsoever. So not just monetary benefit, but no personal benefit. Favor, and by the way, these are all anonymized names, pseudonyms. favor, a Nigerian student who went to an all-black Pentecostal church, described himself as a worker. So until midway into the conversation, we didn't even know whether we were talking about the same thing. But as he said, you work for God, you don't volunteer for God. But this work didn't entail any remuneration, and also volunteer in this context signals something that would be more ad hoc and show lack of commitment versus work. In the case of Mustafa, a Muslim imam that I interviewed, when I used the word volunteer, he immediately referred me to other registered charities, and I had to insist that I actually wanted to speak to him. But even then, he was reluctant about sharing his own individual accomplishments. But he was more open when I tried to tell him to talk about the ethos of the work with which he engaged. And this is the point that I will turn to. So these responses opened up another question for me, which is that we often talk about recognizing informal volunteering from a policy or scholarly perspective, or what are the stakes of not recognizing informal volunteering and the exclusion and invisibilization that entails. But what does recognition mean? And on whose terms do we recognize, and can we get it wrong? Can we get recognition wrong? So there's scholars, who emphasize recognizing informal volunteering on its own terms rather than through the prism of formal volunteering. In the case of formal volunteering, the way we operationalize recognition, or the way state governments and volunteer sector usually operationalize recognition is through volunteer awards, or discursively there's an emphasis on incentivizing volunteering as a pathway to employability. So in other words, sort of emphasizing on its marketability. But in the case of my research, hardly any of my interlocutors involved in faith-based or cultural volunteering expressed an interest in the idea of individual recognition for their work. So responses ranged from dismissal to outright opposition. One of my interlocutors said, if ever a day comes about when I feel I'm doing this because I want to get in the media or the front page, I'm there for the wrong reasons. Mustafa the Imam described the act of recognition for his volunteering in Arabic as ri'a, which was translated as showing off or ostentation or satisfying one's ego or nafs. And Srini, when I talked about volunteering as a pathway to employability, he laughed and he said it's just seva, pure service. And Vivian, a recent migrant from Colombia who volunteered in a church garden, described this relationship of volunteering to employability as a foreign concept that she could not really relate with. Oh, sorry, I think I missed this one, but that's fine. I walked you through this. But this did not mean discarding the question of recognition. It just opened up the question of how to recognize this domain on their terms. And I distilled two kinds, ideational and material recognition. So the ideational recognition that the volunteers sought in faith-based and cultural associations was more for their collective identity and their cause, an acknowledgement of their socio-political concerns, an affirmation of the spirit with which they engaged and why they engaged, and also to be known by the wider community on their own terms and to have their voice represent who they are. In terms of material recognition, the question of physical space and infrastructural support came up again and again. So when they wanted to showcase their identity and their rituals to the wider community, there were not enough open, accessible, and affordable venues. And parks were unsuitable for events mostly. And as they said, nothing is free. Only we human beings are free. But just when the picture looked bleak in terms of platforms of recognition, other stories emerged. Stories of relational and material support between faith-based communities where one church would lend its physical space to another, say, to a Muslim community for iftar gatherings. Or in one case, an Afghan individual from a humanitarian refugee background decided to form a Pashtun association in South Australia to help newly arrived families settle down and preserve their culture. So he did not have resources of his own, but he found colleagues from the Red Cross and Relationships Australia with whom he had formerly volunteered step up to help him register his association and also establish a website. So in other words, he was drawing upon relational support from formal volunteer involving organizations in a way that was not necessarily built into the formal volunteering programs. And this made me think more about intersectionalities between formal and informal spaces predicated on relational and material support without one co-opting the other. So I'm just going to end with this conception or visualization of a volunteering gradient, where informal volunteering often led to formal volunteering due to institutional needs of funding or requirements of longevity, but also sometimes it emerged out of formal volunteering through relational networks that were established in the process. Although in actuality, the picture may be more complex than this because there are relational webs between informal networks. But this was primarily for me to think through the interface of the formal and informal in terms of material and infrastructure and other kinds of support. So I'm just going to leave it there for discussion and elaboration. Thank you.
We might just take a couple of questions and then break for morning tea and people can continue the conversation, but it seems a missed opportunity if we don't ask some questions of both of our speakers. So I'm going to open the floor up. If there's a couple of questions, we'll take those. Elise, thank you.
Yep. Sorry, Peter, I just had a quick question about the online certificate about the blood movement thing. Was that a thing that already existed, or did you have to create that?
The first healthcare provider we worked for was Marta Pathology in Brisbane, and the chief scientist of the blood bank there suggested this would be a good thing to have. So I went online and thought, yeah, well, this is perfect because it really covers all sorts of medical transport in the learning that's in it. And so I made it a requirement. So yeah, it would e-learning Australia, and they have a whole heap of these online courses, and one of them is blood transport.
Any other questions for Peter or Heba?
Peter, just you were talking about the fact that everybody covered their own costs, but you have an app, you have developed a whole lot of things. I'm assuming that there has been some significant cost to you, and is that all fully funded by you?
No, it's not fully funded by me, but I stumbled on the first way that we did it. I stumbled on it, we used an Excel spreadsheet, and because I downloaded it onto my phone, I found that they had that box with the arrow on, and I thought, I wonder what that does. So I hit that, it says copy the link, and then I hit copy link, and it said, do you want to edit it as well? So I said, oh, so I did an edit one, said to one of our volunteers, hey, I'm sending you a link, see if you can make changes to the Excel. He could, so that's the way we did it. Then we had a volunteer in Geelong, and her business was developing apps and stuff, and the Excel spreadsheet gave me serious great hits. 250 people having editable access to an Excel spreadsheet. Oh my God. Anyway, so we had already planned to go to the next phase, which is basically what we've got there. Sabina just said, yeah, I can do that. And we were going to develop an app, which would have meant we had to develop 2 apps, and there's stuff goes on with that. Anyway, so I was in Melbourne. Sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but it's important because it goes to the evolution. She sent me a link, said, look, see what you think of this. And I looked at it, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I want. Yeah, cool. Oh, this is great. And I said, and then I went, well, this looks just like an app. Why don't we, and that way we don't have to do 2. We can actually fix it and make changes ourselves without going to Apple or Google every time. And so, yes. So, you know, I've spent a bit of money talking to people and stuff like that. Volunteering Queensland have helped out. Thank you, Volunteering Queensland. But no, we all it's totally self-funded, and whatever I spend, it's because it's a good thing to do.
Great, thanks so much. An hour or so, we've got a little bit of a presentation from the research team, 10 minutes or so on some of the findings on unpacking informal volunteering. And then we're going to break up into some small group discussions to try and get some ideas from the room around these questions that we're opening up. And then we've got to sort of bring things to a close before we all head over for lunch at the QT. So that's the lineup for this session. We're really keen to get people involved, so do put your hands up in the questions. We've got a large group of people joining us online as well, so the mics are really important for that reason particularly. So let me just start this little presentation that we're going to give, which is a research project that we did. It's mostly led by Heba, who you saw in the earlier section. Heba has done a large, there she is over there, so put your hand up. So we asked Heba to work with us on this project on the basis of the other project that she just did, because you can see that she really started unpacking a lot of the questions around informal volunteering. And I guess one of the reasons we started this work was from a public policy point of view, and from a sort of a view from the volunteering sector. It really does matter how we set categorisations and how definitions start to form without possibly those conversations around the diversity of activities that are in this space. So this presentation is really about drawing together the research that Heba has done, looking at a mix of academic and soft literature, so policy literature and literature like the people we saw this morning, so some of these research reports. So an international sort of survey of academic, scholarly and practice literature and public policy literature as well. So as you can see on the screen there, this is the definition that many of you may have come across from the ABS, which is in the General Social Survey. And it defines informal volunteering as the provision of unpaid work or support to non-household members, excluding that provided only to family members living outside the household. Right? So it's a fairly specific and narrow definition. And I guess the way we're starting to think about it, based on all the threads you saw this morning, is thinking about informal volunteering as a much broader social phenomenon. That ranged from sort of individual acts of care, so we saw that in the whole mutual aid conversation, but it also moves over into the spaces of advocacy, activism and semi-institutionalised community initiatives like we saw from Peter. And I guess one of the things that's common across these definitions is that we all have a sense of what informal volunteering is not, and it's not formal. But beyond that, it gets very messy. And so what we're going to do in the next kind of couple of slides is open up this sort of box of informal volunteering based on some of the diversity of activities that we've kind of identified. And I guess one of the reasons we're doing this is because it does have huge implications for how volunteers are represented in government policies and legislation, also who's included and excluded from those definitions and fundings and policy and regulations, and also questions around voice. So who's being understood in these definitions, and importantly, who's not being included. This is particularly the case because a lot of informal volunteers, if we want to use that as a broad sort of category, are often highly marginalised citizens. Or they may not be citizens at all. So they fall into a very often a voiceless or a weaker kind of political community. And understanding who's doing this kind of activities is really important. So again, this is drawing on Heba's research. What Heba unpacked from this box are these what we're calling sort of axes of differentiation, where we see greatest variation in the definitions of informal volunteering. So if you just bear with us, Elise and I are going to go through these. The first one, I guess, is around the mode of collective action. And we had some of these ideas come up in the MOVE presentation this morning, where we heard around some of the people that were participating were actually doing it because out of mutual aid for a really sort of politicised reasons. But often we think about volunteering as apolitical, right? It's not in party politics and it's something different from activism. And I guess what we're trying to open up here is questions around, well, is it really different from activism? Some groups start as a sort of very grassroots initiative in problem solving, but they soon may face structural problems which take them into the space of advocacy, or their experiential knowledge that they gain in doing work such as Peter's, they gain a lot of insights into on the ground knowledge, and so they're brought into public policy for their voice or their advocacy to represent a particular group. So this is an image, it's not ours, of an attempt by some scholars to try and create some boundaries in this space. It's a bit hard to read and I apologise for that, but essentially what this categorisation is doing, this is sort of from the informal across to what's called the formal. So at one end they're sort of categorising things like helping out, so you might help a neighbour, a friend, importantly without involving an organisation. So that's kind of very clear space of informal volunteering. But as we move over into what's more formal, we see that the boundaries get very murky. So it might be participating through a semi-organisation, and then over right down at this end, we start to see things which they call kind of more formal, a regular commitment to something. We kind of want to problematise the attempts to do this categorisation, because as we heard this morning, sometimes informal initiatives or informal volunteering can be actually very have elements of formality, or they connect in and form hybrid organisations, or they may be a formal organisation that out of the formality becomes an informal initiative. So this mode of collective action is not always straightforward on a dichotomy between informal and formal, and it also isn't as straightforward as saying that informal volunteering sits in this sort of apolitical zone. I've been doing quite a lot of work on the volunteers that have been putting their hand up and participating in fairly spontaneous ways for the community independence movement across Australia. They wouldn't normally sit in a sort of volunteering category, but they also aren't part of a political organisation, and many of them just spontaneously volunteered and then they moved away once the election was gone. So sometimes spaces of advocacy do fall into this informal volunteering space. The next categorisation or axes that we tried to identify and see a lot of variation was this idea of informality. And we heard this morning also that because it's informal doesn't mean it's unstructured and disorganised or unorganised. There's quite a lot of, it might be a flat structure, it might be shared power. I guess one of the things that typically defines the definition that the ABS uses is this idea that it's unmediated by an organisation. I guess as Heba unpacked and we've been starting to explore, sometimes these initiatives emerge out of formal volunteering organisations, or as you mentioned in your question, you know, there actually are government initiatives or grassroots initiatives like Landcare that have become kind of part of government through various support schemes that then morph into something else. So it's a very fluid space, very dynamic. And what we're doing in this discussion paper that we're putting together is really trying to unpack some of that. We heard also with the mutual aid discussion in the UK, we saw this sort of ad hoc spontaneous character, but some of those groups go on and reform. And some of them die out. That's the other thing about these organisations. They fulfill their purpose, and then that's it. So that life cycle is very different as well from classic organisations. I'm just going to hand over to Elise. Before I do that, I should say that this is all coming together in a discussion document that we, a discussion paper that we have drafted, and we're hoping to use some of the insights from the discussion today to finalise that, and we will circulate that after, you know, the end of this month or next month.
Oh, can you click it over for me? Thanks. Okay, so the third axis is around the scale of action, and this is really about the relationship with care. So for a lot of formal volunteering definitions often see volunteering apart from care, and for example the ABS defines volunteering outside the household, so that's differentiating care work within the household, which is of course gendered, but we also know that informal volunteering work encompasses huge amounts of emotional, relational support, as well as domestic assistance. So it's sort of muddying that definition. And then, of course, on top of that, that we know that not getting this right can exclude lots of structurally marginalised folks, and a lot of research has shown that non-Western and First Nations community practices are often situated within joint family systems and embody kin as including the community, not just the small nuclear family unit. And so there's no real, what this means is that there's no real distinct break between the family unit and community, and also the relationship between care and volunteering. My own research working with the Human Rights, Social Justice, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Junoska and her team, we've been interviewing 100 women, First Nations women around the country. And one thing that's very clear about that is that care includes, you know, general definitions of, you know, inside the household, but way, way, way beyond that, including care of community and, of course, including care of country. And so thinking about these broader ways in which people contribute is really, really important. And just to acknowledge Bev Gars's artwork there, Caring for Kin. The final axis that we just wanted to raise with you is that that often volunteering is thought about as unpaid and without financial remuneration. And whilst this is the case, what's really important for us to reflect on, and there's already been questions to that effect, is thinking about the different spectrum evaluation that happens within the space of unpaid. And so, for example, in informal volunteering, people will say we love it, we do it because we love it, but also we can think of it as unpaid care. And, you know, there's a long history of feminist research that has documented the free riding of the economy on unpaid care work within the household and more broadly, in that the economy free rides on unpaid work that keeps everybody alive, keeps everyone connected, everyone together. But also thinking about exploitation and offloading. We've heard questions around that. So informal volunteering could be one of those, but it also could be a bit of a hybrid mix too. And we must think about questions of valuation, particularly also when we're thinking about policy.
Okay, we want to just capture some of this rich conversation that you're all having. So if you could get someone in your group to start thinking about what were some of the themes, and we're going to collect some of these ideas as we go through. So it's really, really important that we're all in this conversation together. So if we could have a bit of hush so we can draw the conversation out into the room, because it sounds like there's lots of brilliant insights that people are keen to share. So if we could get each group thinking about what were the themes that were coming out. Was it straightforward to answer these questions, or what were the themes that came out? We've got a roving microphone here. Because we have people online, it's really important that those that want to speak and have got something to say, just have the mic. And Heba's going to do some scribing. We're going to start with the first question, which is around questions of support and representation and voicing informal volunteers. We know that you guys are all the experts who are working with this stuff, so we'd love to hear of some practical ideas that people have in this space of support and representation, or questions that you're particularly wrestling with. So do we have a group that's willing to volunteer first? Of all the audiences, I'm hoping someone puts a hand up. There we go, great. Thank you.
Volunteering. On the first question, we struggled with having a formal definition or structure of informal volunteering. So for us, in our discussion, it was around that informal volunteering as a concept gives us we then understand what formal volunteering is not. And so that then would shape how we support and represent volunteers. And Natalie here, who does the volunteer program for the Wollongong City Council, gave a wonderful example of where they have a formal volunteer program that runs sort of week in, week out. But when a crisis or a disaster occurs, it's more that the assets of the council are required rather than the volunteers. And the volunteers go with the assets of their trucks and their graders and big equipment. But they have a contract with the state government. The council can drop and relax all of its policies in relation to the use of volunteers on their assets. But because they're funded by state and they have requirements of the state bureaucracy becomes, that's part of the second question.
Yes.
But just understanding that you can have formal volunteering that can morph into informal volunteering because of circumstances.
That's right, and we heard that in the UK was exactly the same case. And sometimes informal volunteering or groups that start very grassroots become formalised or institutionalised and then come out the other end and reject that support or whatever it is. So very dynamic. Anyone want to add or build on that? Oh. Yes, I think that's it.
So my name is Sumaya and I'm a researcher at a few
Oh, great.
How you can support them is by listening to them because it is from the level, from bottom up. It is a grassroots movement. So the two things that came out very strongly were listening to what they want to, listening to what the community wants and empowering them to do that. Because there are lots of barriers that prevent them from doing this. So they'll manage just to make their life more easier. You're listening to empower them.
Yep. So maybe just a follow-up question on that, because listening, we sometimes don't have the infrastructure for listening. We have lots of infrastructure for talking.
And that's where social media comes in.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
That is something that, because that's what I'm investigating. And social media platforms used to voice out, to let people hear their voice. And so that is an important medium for other organizations to tap into.
Yep.
And that's why my research methodology looked into how I could actually tap into spontaneous volunteers and get their experiences. And social media was good.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's really interesting work. I hope you've got those down, Heba. Yes, yes. So there was a point here.
It's Hassan Talal from the Multicultural Roundtable on Emergency Response. I found the informal volunteering sometimes give you access to support some communities that's not been represented in the formal organization, and in some cases may even be forgotten by the local authorities.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you have, just a follow-up question? Are there sort of instances where you know where groups have had to use other means like political means or protesting, or what have they? Yep.
Like even when they call the main local authorities, local authorities like services or police, some like they don't have interpreters for them on board, which is we suggested like starting like kind of hotline or something like this during emergency for this, for people who have language barriers, some come from disability background and they don't have access to cars, like depends on the means have to be hotline. And yeah, we have some people who are stuck in areas, but there's no authority. Like they call the police. It's not an emergency phone, like on their list. Like there's a specific list for each organization to attend that event.
Yes. Yep.
All the same ethic, same religion, same community center, even they speak the same language. Yes, not when people like this, sometimes they find no solution other than risk their lives and put themselves like on board, especially like if they've already some expertise if they want to become on an organization.
Yeah, that's such a really important point about this sort of visibilization of groups or non-groups. They're actually in our communities. That I was actually in Shepparton after the floods, and it's a really dynamic community. So Elise, I think he's got to follow up, and then we'll move to someone else.
Give example of solution.
Yes.
So the job but with that, say, the small multicultural team, we managed to get 600 of these with 65 different language within 3 days.
Amazing. Wow. So you get to see that sort of how nimble and creative informal volunteers can be. Any groups? There's a question or hand there.
Hello, I'm Heidi from Adawy. I support our principals and preschool directors to implement volunteer policy in our schools, and there's 25,000 volunteers in our public primary schools and secondary schools. So I was sort of looking at it, well, how do we, so that's already existing, how do we now introduce more informal volunteering? And people in our group, it was really interesting. So we've got some people here from Singapore who've come for this conference, and they're from the sporting sector. And so it was interesting to see, rather than, because we've been talking a lot about informal volunteering and spontaneous volunteering and emergency disaster relief, but how do we introduce informal volunteering in already very structured way? Programs that have been there for years and years. And in Singapore, if you don't mind me saying what you said, their sport volunteering is very formal. So, and they'll have parents drop the kids, so say kids sport, parents will drop their kids off at sport, just sit on the sides and they're not talking with one another. There's a great opportunity there in Singapore, and probably in a lot of our sectors that have been going for many, many years, to activate that group of people sitting on the sidelines to create community. And that's what they would really love to see. Is that the right way you do? Yeah. And to me, that was really significant. So what informal volunteering can do is, well, how do we create stronger communities within our very formal structures already? And informal volunteering could be a way of doing that. So I thought that was really valuable.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess it taps into that point that Harriet, they were talking about this morning around, you do have some of these spontaneous or informal volunteers that specifically reject working with government or being embedded in something. And so there is this sort of question around, can you seed informal volunteers, or is it something that has to emerge? I think you can probably do both. There's a question here or a suggestion?
Like.
Yes or no, or you...
Just in our group, I guess we looked at the question and that definition of informal volunteering, and we had a discussion around, I don't know whether we came to an outcome today, in that informal volunteering is really about your community relationships. It's how you get them in community values. And so I guess I'll speak, maybe I said this and others agreed or didn't agree. That shifted, our values in community have shifted in Australia. It's moved, our society's changed, and with that, so is what informal volunteering looks like. And so part of it, I would say, it's got nothing to do with formal volunteering at all. It's a relationship you have in your community. I heard a chap speak at the Volunteering Vic State Conference who spoke about communiteering.
Yeah.
And that really resonates. It's about your relationship with your own community. I think that connects with some non-Western society and Indigenous places. It's about, it's those values you have, about you driving one-on-one or group relationships with your community, not organisations.
Yep.
So I'd say it's got nothing to do with an organisation involved, which is thought of in the definition. It's not informal anymore. There's no way, it's there. That's the spontaneous. When you move into organisations, you move into the spontaneous volunteering because you're looking for short-term, simple engagement. So anyway, and so therefore, question number 2 is policy change. If we want to drive that community style of contribution, is more around other policy areas, not specifically potentially in the volunteer spaces, through other policy areas that might need to influence how we behave as a community and society.
Thanks so much. I can see your badge there, so Vincent, thank you. Look, I'm going to open that up because I think that raises a whole lot of questions around whether or not people agree with, you know, is it just community based? You know, we heard earlier that there's a lot of relationships that are international across things. It's not always hyper local. And yeah, want to just see if anyone wants to add to that or ask a question.
Australia as well, and I haven't got any answers for you, but definitely in terms of the policy, we think that is changed. Probably just from a big perspective, the North Forks have done it differently. Probably a little bit, it's almost like a sad thing that we adapted in COVID to get our sports back, to get people engaged in the communities again. And we were prepared to do anything to do that, to get people back. But then we put all the rules back in place. And then we took out that flexibility that we had. And in terms of policy, like I liken it to, you know, well, we didn't use the seatbelts and now we have to, you know, and we used to have black and white TVs and now we've got to keep reading, otherwise we get left behind. Because when they're used to doing things, particularly in remote areas and such, it's that change and how we communicate that change is a big challenge in terms of policy for us.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's good. Is there anyone else? Yeah, we have one here and one here. Thank you. It was here. Oh, yep. It's a lightning.
Annette Shepherd, a BQ volunteer, Queensland. It's a question really, is to what extent do we inhibit informal volunteering by introducing formal structures? Because, well, COVID in particular brought out a lot of informal offers of volunteering. But there was a lot of inhibition of that because of the formalities that we had to go through on a lot of levels to enable people to volunteer.
Yeah, and it gets to that question around, is it just about adaptation or is it about people kind of loosening the structures? Please.
Yes, Shane Harris here from United Care. And just picking up a couple of threads that are happening and even some of the conversations in our group as well. And but one of those things is, do we need to define informal volunteering? Because I just think it's such an us thing in the formal world to have to define it. But I wonder if they don't want it to be defined in the first place, because that's so against the nature of it. And leading from that, and I wonder if there's opportunity to support informal volunteering by having a mediator, someone to work in that space, because we do work in different worlds. And the big thing in our conversation was this risk aspect, of the little alarms that go off in our worlds as we talk about and think about risks. But that's our world, it's not their world. And is there opportunity to have a mediator to support that relationship that appeases both our risk going off and also helps resource and facilitate the needs that are being met in that informal volunteering environment? So is there opportunity to resource it, recognise it through that relationship of mediation and support?
Which is what
Yeah, that idea of someone sort of in the successful cases, I think Harriet said there was this interlocutor, or I can't remember the word she used, who would bridge those worlds. Yeah. Back, thanks.
Yes, hi. South Wales Government. We have our third iteration of a volunteering strategy. So the notion of policy has been an evolutionary process for us. We are now at a point where it's not an either or in terms of the understanding of volunteering, but the multiplicity of it. And a formal volunteer is not necessarily just formally volunteering. They will be doing the plus. They'll be doing the extra little bits that are all informal volunteering. Similarly,
they may have started as an informal volunteer or rocked up in to spontaneously help with something, and that's evolved in multiple ways. So it's in terms of modelling and policy responses, we're seeing it as not as an either or, but how can we look at it from a multi-dimensional spectrum and the fluidity of that. The other thing that we're looking at is place-based responses, so that what is mobilised and happening in a community of 500 people will be very different in its dynamic and its model to what's happening in Sydney. But we're okay with that. But it's taken us a long time to be okay with that. So in response to those two questions, how is informal volunteering shaping how we support and represent volunteers? It's our recognition of that multiplicity and that fluidity in the approaches. Because even during COVID, informal volunteering still had a level of structure. There was still social distancing. You still had to hand sanitize. You still had to have a mask on. There was still structure there because of the public health orders and the requirements. And there's a level of forgetting that that was still a structure.
Yep.
In terms of our policy challenges moving forward is us keeping pace with the dynamic nature of it and being okay with, in some policy and response contexts, letting go. From my approach at a state level with the volunteering strategy, we're okay to let go, but we're finding it's then individual and the state government entities and at different levels even within one of those entities, but also at local council level in an emergency context, different again. And so how do we chip away at those challenges? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but how do you structurally set it up so that it's happy and healthy and dynamic and able to evolve with the facilitation and the supports that it needs?
Yeah, thank you. That was a good sort of summary, I think, of some of the themes coming out in Heba's report, including that formal volunteering itself is in a dynamic space too, particularly with declining numbers of members. So there's a dynamism in what we think is this fixed thing, which you captured well. We'll have two more questions and then we might have to wrap up. So.
That's okay. So we're very cognizant of that. However, I think the key takeaways from us today is us as formal volunteers need to be able to then design an informal environment. We know what's required of the work that we need and the kind of support that we need, so we can actually help define those because we already exist in that space. So for us, we're thinking about parallels rather than trying to integrate. So it's about freeing up our formal volunteers to actually do those compliances, work inside that environment, and then provide an opportunity for the informal to be able to meet the needs and free those formal volunteers to do their jobs. So I guess coming back to alignment of goals and our mission statement, our volunteers and why people volunteer, and hook into that, understand that informal volunteers are going to align with what you're trying to achieve, and how can we facilitate their connection with you without burdening them with communications and allow them to have that freedom to be able to function in that space and not compromise our business. So I think we're equipped as volunteers to be able to build that environment and then move forward and start thinking about that. So a combination of we've got the skill sets and alignment with goals and missions. I think that's really.
Yeah, and I think on the ground, just as a parent of kids in Scouts, there is a lot of informal volunteering that goes on. And so at that very sort of decentralised level, there is informal stuff going on. Yeah. Last question.
Thank you. Not question.
Oh, solution.
I like the concept. but I also think there's a continuity. So when you think about organisations or charities or not-for-profits, they're often birthed out of a need. And we've seen this particularly with the spontaneous situation with, you know, needing to meet needs that are really immediate and urgent. And so that's created this community response, which is informal. And I just think we can be quite scared. I work at, sorry, Penny from the Salvation Army, to say that, sorry. So yeah, also formal. But I think, you know, we can be quite spooked, I think, by the spontaneous nature because it's uncontrolled and uncontrolling, potentially. But really, I would suggest that that's actually the journey towards volunteering. And so from a society that has this need in a disaster to do something meaningful, which is a beautiful thing about this country, is that people do want to either give financially or physically, and a lot of people need to do that to cope with their own stresses, to think I can make a difference here because it's something I'm not happy, you know, I'm feeling very out of control. To do something is really helpful. And so creating those pathways for people to do that, whether it's through informally, can then actually lead them to something more formal. And I think that's where the birth of new organisations, we see lots of little not-for-profits coming out because they're meeting a very felt need at the time. And it starts informal, like our blood bike friend, and then becomes something that is either semi or becomes formal. So I think it's just a natural way in which people start from informal to becoming organised over time. And some of those things will drop away, but some will rise and stay.
Thanks so much. That's a great point. I'm going to hand it over to Elise, who's going to wrap us up so we all can make our way over to lunch.
Yeah, okay. How do you wrap this up? This conversation, thank you everyone for your contributions. I'm wondering from those questions, what other questions do you have about informal volunteering? What is, you know, floating around in your mind as, you know, something that hasn't been touched on or something that needs more thinking through? Yeah.
Just keep thinking of, you know, we are formalising, you know, informal volunteering a bit. A few years ago at the National Volunteering Conference, this was called Rogue Volunteers, and to see how this has progressed, you know, to now actually it's okay. You know, we just need to put these structures around them. But one thing is, what about just the random acts of kindness that people do? Why do we have, you know, I don't know, I haven't heard that in the conversation. And you know, do we even have to call that volunteering? I don't think it is. I think it's just part of humanity. And also children, I come with that perspective too. Under 18-year-olds and the enormous amount of informal volunteering they do without any recognition. So.
Thank you. Important. Just over in the middle there.
Sorry, just.
Thank you, just Mara Bosanovich from Volunteering Queensland. I might just need Amanda to give me this stat, but I don't think one thing that we've brought up is that in the spontaneous volunteers that we've used during COVID and in disasters, more than 3/4 of them, and also in the Olympic and Com Games, more than 3/4 of them already volunteer formally. So spontaneous volunteers, most of them already volunteer, and they just fit things into their lives when they can.
Thanks. My name's Isabel. I've been doing my PhD on how emergency service volunteers do community engagement. And part of that research has been finding how, you know, I think we were discussing it in the group here, how the emergency service sector, you know, we just mentioned rogue volunteers. There's a tension in some sectors about informal volunteering or spontaneous volunteering. And so I think one of the things I've been thinking, obviously, how do we deal with that tension in policy, and how do we think about the relationship with that idea in general, depending on, you know, whether it's a disaster or whether it's other things. So.
In large volunteering organisations, it's particularly in the emergency sector. That's what you said, yeah, and spontaneous volunteers. Yeah, a lot of that was borne out in the bushfires, particularly. I'm sure in the floods in Queensland, you've seen a lot of those tensions. Right.
Really like the volunteer volunteer pass was mentioned by the UK speakers in the morning. That could be a solution for two challenges with SDM bushfire and the flood. The informal loss of identity for the informal volunteers when the expertise is not allowed to go there. This could fix this solution. The other thing is I would like to call them the bystanders was actually act like the informal volunteers, but they go for the sake of just having fun and doing social media, they put in their lives and other people are it's gonna come for risk to them. That could be a solution, especially like if city council, I think council maybe they could issue an emergency.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking everyone that's contributed in this. That's for everyone that spoke in the small group, so that's for everybody, as well as in here too. I have a few points just to finish up on. Caroline mentioned that that we're pulling together a discussion paper that will be sent out to everybody through Volunteering Australia in some time. We collect our thoughts after today's discussion, so bear with us. But thank you for all your interesting discussion. It's I think it is one point that's standing out to me is it's nothing about volunteering at all, which I think is interesting, isn't it? Because if we free ourselves then from thinking within particular frames, you know, interesting, innovative possibilities may further emerge. We're also thinking about, with Volunteering Australia, about a network of folks in this space, thinking in this space, just to continue the conversation. Clearly, this thinking is going on everywhere, and just sort of linking everybody up. We're still thinking about how that could work and what it should include. So if you have any thoughts about that, do you mind flicking to the next slide? Yes. There'll be an email there. Any one of us, and if you've got any ideas about how that network could work for you, and work for the collective more broadly, that would be excellent. So I have to tell you that now is lunchtime at QT, the hotel at QT, which is on the sort of towards Civic in Canberra. You don't have to understand any of what that means because there are awesome volunteers here. But you will be directed. So if you just start walking out the door, you'll be right. Formal start of the conference after that.